Thanks for joining us, and welcome to, I guess, what one could call the penultimate event of this little conference we've been enjoying over the last few days. I believe that we're one of the last sessions of the formal conference, and after here it's all party. So no problem there. I'm delighted that we were able to pull this session together because I think it ties in and brings in some strong and powerful voices on a topic I think which is central to those of us who are leading schools or involved with curricular decisions and involved with the policy decisions associated with architectural education, about how we should focus an education for a student as they're engaging a career that could last and into an evolving and very fluid environment in the next 50 years for any one of our students who might be graduating in a couple of years. And how we begin to negotiate at conditions where there are so many different career paths and so many different changes in the profession that they will be facing. The model, I suppose the fundamental question that sits behind this, there are two questions behind this session, is the sort of fundamental generalist model of architectural education where most of the schools have very similar curricula, probably tied to the criteria of and conditions of an accreditation process, but also certainly tied to the educations that all of us had. At this point, I was comparing notes with Marlene Davis, and we realized we met 40 years ago as freshmen in a design studio in college. So certainly part of our educational vision is conditioned by the experiences that we had 40 years ago. And so clearly that model, which I think, although we have variety, we have a lot of similarity too, is one that we need to challenge. Certainly within the humanities, the notion of specialization and focus has been the dominant model, certainly within the sciences as well. One of the questions that I think we can begin to engage is, can we remain a generalist profession? But there are certainly contradictions. I'll return to this slide in a moment, but I showed this slide earlier, and I haven't at the business meeting. And I didn't spring this one on Mark, but I don't know if he recognizes it. But this is an image from the recently released study of career options or career, basically, kinds of jobs that graduates from Syracuse University are doing now. So that they surveyed the entire field of alumni that they are in touch with last year, saying, what kind of work do you do in your office? What are the things that you do within your professional life? And I don't know if you can read all the little subcategories, but the big orange chunk is less than half. And Syracuse, historically was a pretty straight up architecture program. Standalone, not a multidisciplinary program, and typically, over the course of its long history, prepared people for a normative view of what the profession might be. And yet, if you look at this chart, certainly the categories over on the right, from exhibition design down to the pastry arts, offer a variety of kinds of jobs. Now, in this whole kind of discussion that we've had about the 13.9% unemployment of recent graduates taken out of the 2009 census survey, some have argued that, well, we should be educating students for a kind of public practice where they engage the kinds of problems that the world faces in a proactive way, and not be necessarily limited to normative views of the profession or even a broader sense of the profession. But what I found interesting about this, Tom Fisher's recent article about in response to the 13.9 certainly was advocating for public service, public nonprofit work. The nonprofit piece, there are a lot of little points of orange in this, but the problem with nonprofit is that you don't get paid. And the nonprofit piece, I think, is this little slice of orange there. So it certainly brings up an issue, I think, that we can begin to engage as we think about how any individual school within its specific context and mission can craft strategies for advancing their graduates for the next 50 years. We have a great panel to discuss this. Mark Robbins, who's dean at Syracuse University. Prior to that was the director of design at the National Endowment for the Arts. Nader Tehrani, who is, well, Nader, would you call yourself a starchitect? I mean, I know that that has kind of negative connotation, but you're the closest thing to it, I think, that we have. Anyway, Nader is clearly a internationally recognized designer, both for his work at Office Da and in his new firm, Nada. But more than that, and really the reason that we need his voice in this setting is that he has been an influential educator at a number of schools, but of course is now head of the Department of Architecture at MIT, which is a very, very particular place and might offer some interesting lessons as we think about these questions. Donna Robertson is the dean at the IIT, where she had to inherit a particular kind of pedagogy that had a lot of Mies residue, I suspect, when she joined that institution and took on her leadership role, and has been involved in some pretty interesting discussions in that context. And we're delighted to have her here as well. We have two respondents who will comment after our three presenters. Ted Landsmark, who I believe you all know, who is president of the Boston Architectural College, and which is a pretty unique organization with a very specific mission in its own right. And James Cramer, who as head of the Greenway group, probably has a broader view of the profession than anyone, certainly in this hemisphere, and has, I believe, visited over 1,000 firms, maybe more. He'll tell us perhaps later. But is certainly someone who understands the profession, understands the schools, and could begin to maybe offer some interesting perspectives on this question. So to get us started, I've asked Mark to get us started, and I'll see if I can find your PowerPoint here. Is it this one, Mark, right?
Yeah, that's it. Okay, good. Identify that building. This is actually a slide quiz. Judy, thanks very much. I actually haven't thought about us as a normative school, or not for a while, but it's interesting to think about it that way.
Maybe it was for a long time.
And thank you for organizing this and having us here. It's interesting. It seems that it's kind of cyclical. As a profession, we look at ourselves, and especially in down markets, we look at ourselves even more carefully. But I think more fields are beginning to look at architecture and looking at the ways in which they can model themselves on the way we teach, on something which has to do with a kind of general knowledge of the world. I was just at a convening yesterday at the Mellon Foundation, and they were very interested in the ways in which Mellon, which does very kind of straight line art historical and humanities funding, could look at architecture and urban design discourses and to look at the interaction between the two. We see this also in colleges of engineering who are interested in the kind of less discursive way, or the seemingly less discursive way that we approach our discipline. I'm showing this, it's Pergamon, or Munich, and it's this great photograph by Thomas Struth, and it recalls for me the way that architecture was taught through teaching casts. We would literally model our own sort of knowledge of the profession by drawing and redrawing fragments and pieces of architecture. I love the domestication of architecture. It's like the Temple of Dendur at the Met. But I think about, and I guess this is the thrust of the way I think about what we do at Syracuse, and it really has to do with strategies for intervention and the way that as a school, as administrators, and as faculty, we model the various ways in which students can intervene in the world and to be intellectually agile enough to respond to change, because of course we can't predict change. In 1983, some of you may remember this Mac commercial, right? This had it started out with there was a runner with a huge hammer running down the aisle who was going to kind of throw this through the screen, and this was supposed to be evil IBM, and the whole technology world was going to change just with the shattering of the screen. And this was shown for, I think it cost him $1.5 million at the time to show this image. And of course, the world has both changed and it hasn't changed. And that's the way technologies succeed each other, not in complete, perfect chapters, but in very, very layered ways. I think it's why, as architects, we always like Blade Runner, because it shows the kind of coexistence of earlier technologies with new technologies. But we have to think about the way that new technologies do change the way we interact, and also the way we think about physical space. We clearly live in a time of great kind of social networks. We just saw the Occupy series, whether it's Occupy New York or Occupy Philadelphia. And as architects, we had to feel heartened in some way that physical space still mattered enough. And it was the way that we could manifest our publicness in physical space, so that Michael Kimmelman, now writing in the New York Times, who was formerly an arts writer, could talk about physical space and could talk about the kind of history of the polis, which is of course not news to any of us, but to have that spoken about in a kind of trade context was very good. At Syracuse, we think about this in multiple ways. This is work by Anna French, both in a studio and in an elective course, that kind of proposed the different modes of gathering and collecting through virtual technologies. So the coexistence between new technologies and physical space, or the faculty's investigations. This is one of the exhibitions in our gallery space that looked at the way in which new technologies are explored, both in terms of fabrication and representation. There's Michael Pelkin's wind generator. There are a whole host of ways in which technology is used. But we also explore various representational strategies. Brian Lonsway's in the audience, and I hope that this is his work on food. If not, I'm crediting it anyway, Brian, so if you nod, that's good. Which looked at the ways in which the movement of food, the movement of resources, and kind of determine or are affected by our physical aggregation in cities. And thinking about location, which is all, we do think about introducing students to life in other places than the United States, though certainly we travel broadly in the United States. And it's more than just getting a better cup of coffee. This is the Orchidiana in, somebody help me. Thank you. And, you know, we've had Sergio Fajardo, who's the fantastic mayor of Medellin, and it's one of the best examples that really puts a lie to the fact that in order to do innovative, progressive architecture, you need to have huge quantity of funds. So here there's public will to use architecture in very beautiful ways that has a good deal of impact. So the students have been in Medellin a couple of times now. This past summer they were in Rajasthan looking at stepwells. We travel broadly to look at cities. We've started our own programs, satellite programs in New York and in London, as well as our long-running program in Florence. And again, these expose students to various ways of thinking about urbanity and the way cities are formed. Here, LA, hence Blade Runner, and Tokyo. Judith had asked me to look at really the way in which we focus on place in Syracuse. And I show these earlier slides of, you know, kind of tours around the world because it's very easy to think about kind of mining the assets of a place, especially in a post-industrial city like Syracuse, as looking like one thing. If there's anything we try to do is expose students to a wide array, a wide bandwidth, from theory to cash flows to preservation and technology. It's important that students actually understand the wide range in which we participate in culture, not just material culture. And being in a city like Syracuse, the narrative of the shrinking city actually makes a good deal of sense, though Syracuse, unlike many other cities, is actually fairly stable in terms of its population base, though it does present the issues of a lack of population and a diminished tax base. We've done in the 8 years that I've been at Syracuse, at least one semester per year focused on Syracuse. This is some of the work that came out of a studio Julia Zerniak had organized with people like Michael Beirut and Stas, the landscape architect, and a hydrologist, as well as an urban planner from Cleveland. And in this, we tried to look at the ways in which Syracuse could be a base for a series of design projects. This is actually a billboard that was done by Michael Beirut of Pentagram as part of that work. So we tried to participate in the local context, and this takes place in multiple forms, through standard kind of commissioning practices at the university or in the city, but also dealing with public-private partnerships, and I'll show you a little bit of that. This is not one of our projects. But this is Syracuse in some weird fictional way. This is something called Destiny. It used to be Destiny with a capitalized NY, and then it became Destiny USA, so more global. This was meant to attract 60 million people a year to Syracuse, and just stand it. I love the fact that just outside of this is one of the largest Superfund sites in America, a truly kind of polluted, glow-in-the-dark lake. And this is an odd kind of conflation between the Erie Canal and Venice, heavy on the Erie Canal. This is Luca, I think. This is Dallas, and this is Luca. It's supposed to have a green footprint, but we've yet to see this happen. I'll show a picture of what this looks like. But this is Syracuse in actuality, and it actually is the kind of typology of the kind of second-tier American city. The road, the highway, the interstate, which separates downtown from the rest of the city. That kind of globular Mothra egg is the dome. That's campus. And then the city of Syracuse, for those who haven't been here, is here. It's actually not very, very far at all, but it's about a mile too. But it's, of course, worlds apart. And this is really our base of operation, or a base of operation. While we're also in Istanbul during the summer, we come back to Syracuse. This reciprocity between the most kind of prosaic or quotidian aspects of our lives and things which appear to be more exotic, like being in Rwanda, actually work within the same curriculum. This is actually what Destiny turned into. So it's a series of 6-story tip-up walls, and so this is now what greets you as you enter Syracuse. And this got a 30-year tax abatement for the developer. In order to begin to sort of change practice, or at least influence practice, and this goes between the university and the city, and am I okay? Okay, good. No, I just got one of those, you're over, so I wanted to, okay, good. Okay, great. So we started Upstate, which was a center of design, research, and real estate, and I was very conscientious about welding things like real estate with research and design, because it seems to me we do all of those things, and I was also mindful of us being thought about at some other level than the standard kind of community design center, which would be repainting porches in communities, because that wasn't really the pitch at all. We wanted to have a greater impact on the city and also thinking about future development in the city and in the region. I had to renovate my building, and as many of you know, we moved the School of Architecture downtown for about 2 years. Part of us is still down there. We have 4 studios that run. And the kind of hallmark cards view of this was that it was a beacon downtown, and in fact, it operates just like that. Because a studio is in operation till 2 or 3 in the morning, and you would see students, Busby Berkeley-like, in front of those windows. And it was a very, very good way to simultaneously mark the presence of design and architecture in an architecture school in the center of the city. Great for students to see the city daily, but also very good and central to the university's way of presenting itself to the city and reinscribing the value of partnerships between the university and the city. So we did a number of convenings and exhibitions. The first of these was Syracuse Builds, which showed the first of the 12 projects that were on the boards. We've done a number since then. What you're looking at is the law school proposal by Richard Gluckman of Gluckman Manor. Gluckman Manor are also the architects who did the renovation of that warehouse building. The only downside of that is we did it in 10 months, and we did it for a really, really low figure, which Richard has sworn me not to tell others. And so there was this expectation that we would be able to build for, in that kind of price point forever, which is of course not the case. Real estate is part of what we're trying to do, so we've brought up people like Phil Ahrens from Millennium Partners or Douglas Durst to begin to talk about the relationship between what we do as architects and real estate development practice. My sense is students can't be configured as, sort of this 19th century atelier-based febrile creatures. They actually need to know what a pro forma is, because it's their only hope of actually instantiating something which looks like change. And we've been much more engaged in the selection of architects who build on campus through public and private partnerships. So this is Toshiko Mori's Center of Excellence building, which is just at the apron of campus. And this was, in fact, done through state funds, but I was able to insert myself, and this is the first building that I worked on the selection, so I helped to organize the selection process. And the chancellor was very, very gratified by the selection of Toshiko and is pleased with the results, and created a new position on campus, which was the senior university advisor on architecture and urban initiatives, a position that I occupy. So it's very, very good that qua dean, but also as a faculty member and as an architect, there's a voice that speaks for design at the university and also within the city. As part of kind of wedding city with campus, we ran a competition, this is now probably 4 years ago or 5 years ago, for something we called the Connective Corridor. This was the idea of the chancellor. And for those of you who know the High Line, it's not dissimilar. It's about making a linear swath. We had no great, sexy 19th century artifact or early 20th century artifact. But the strategy is similar, to make development more dense along a swath. And this, where the L is the university, and then the green bar, oh, it's the other way. The red is downtown, and the green is where the university is. And the competition was won by Jim Corner, Field Operations, working with Clear, that's Julia Cerniak. And it's now being, the first 3 nodes of it are being built by Olin and Partnerships, who are hired as a successive firm. So Upstate becomes a center for research as well. Julia Cerniak, who's the director of Upstate and has been for the past 4 years, organized this conference, Formerly Urban, looking at the various modes that cities really around the world have used to reinvigorate cities. Our little neighborhood is the Near West Side, which is just down the hill from campus, where we've been able to kind of divert or channel the money that was meant to go for stormwater treatment plants, for more localized water management. Again, this is a work done by Upstate with Julia at the head. She now has a staff of 4 architects and landscape architects. Buildings like this that have lain fallow have been converted. This will be the new public broadcasting stations. This is a project by Koning Eisenberg of Santa Monica, who I've paired with a local architect. We need to do this to be mindful of the kind of the balance locally between architects from outside of one city and the local architectural community. Similarly, Brynenstuhl and Lynch, Brad Lynch, redid this 28,000 square foot warehouse space into live-work lofts and offices. And one of our faculty, John Lott, has just finished La Casita, which is a Spanish cultural association, for very, very little money. He did this beautiful kind of Saarinen-like spine on the lower level of a building. And I'll leave you just with this last project. We did a competition 3 years ago called From the Ground Up, partnering with the Center of Excellence and also with Home Headquarters. It's a local social service housing provider, and convinced them to allow us to work in this neighborhood, which looks like many neighborhoods from the teens and the 20s of the last century, that not only have aging fabric in terms of housing, but the fabric itself is characterized by lots and lots of missing teeth. And you have kind of well-meaning, but both kind of formally and spatially not particularly bright approaches of, habitat or state housing authorities, both of which you see here. And we've brought in, we had 7 teams compete. We had Nader and Halim, and all of whom did fantastic projects. We gave each design team $25,000, which was R&D. That's a difficult thing to do in a neighborhood that has a median income of $14,000 annually. And this is the Cook and Fox House. This is ARO working with Della Valle and Bernheimer. And students are working as well to build houses new, working with our faculty member Tim Stenson and a visiting critic, Fred Stell. And they're also working on renovations of some of this older housing stock. All of this will be compiled in a series of publications. The first of these will be Formerly Urban. There'll be another one on From the Ground Up houses. There'll be 5 books in total, designed by Pentagram and Princeton. Princeton will be doing them, and they'll be out in the fall. So I guess that goes back to the kind of larger question about why we're here. You can take it either at the existential sense or the more specific disciplinary level. And I think it's a good question. And again, the reason that building good architecture and occupying areas that we don't generally occupy as architects, or people don't think we should occupy as architects, is important, is because our students are watching. And this is the way we model for them the way professionals, the way academics, the way intellectuals actually participate in the world. It's actually very, very critical for us to have the highest aspirations because it's the only way they learn. Thanks.
A lot of great work.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Next, we're going to have Nader. Since you don't have a slide, do you want me to go to a black screen maybe? I'll see if I can figure out how to do that.
Or you have the prettiest slide that he has on.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Use the slides.
This-
Do another
A little blue screen.
Okay.
Oh,
You answer.
thanks very much.
There's some text
Yeah?
coming in.
Okay, good. If it's good, I'll read it.
Okay, so I've prepared something to read for you. It's more of a positional statement. It would like to describe the state of education today and some of our ambitions for MIT, but more importantly, it's important to know that it's hard to represent MIT. MIT's culture is a highly disaggregated series of discipline groups, and to have an MIT dropout as their leader is already a suspicious issue. So with that, I launch into my assessment of the situation after a year of having been there, and I call it Beyond a Hippocratic Oath, the Necessity for Critical Specification. The nature of the architectural discipline has shifted quite radically in the last 20 years. Much can be disputed about what constitutes discipline, but there's little doubt that developments in the media around which design revolves have constituted nothing less than a game change. Much of this is due to technology and the accompanying redistribution of power, knowledge, and access to which this digital era has given rise. There's little doubt that the expanded population of practitioners and critics that this access allows is a positive development. But there are implications that attend the rise of a super technical class of designers, and no simple analogs can be made to generations that came before. For those who witnessed and participated in the transition from pencil to mouse, me being one of them, it involved the iterative task of perpetually catching up with emerging software while also helping to rethink some of the fundamental paradigmatic shifts that it involved. How form is conceived, how fabrication processes are rethought, who authors what, how accountability shifts from one hand to another, the new relations between process and product. These are only a few among a range of factors impacted by this powerful disciplinary shift. It also involves a certain degree of paranoia, an acceptance of the impossibility of constant relevance. A simultaneous transformation has acted upon schools of thought, where once we could easily identify the authorities of Rossi, Rowe, Haydock, and Koolhaas, in turn we could also identify the institutions that were the breeding grounds of their speculations, techniques, and processes. Notwithstanding the headcount of those who have departed, this generation was also the last to have the luxury of maintaining the hegemonic link between persona, institution, and the idea of a school of thought. Of them, maybe Koolhaas is the exception, and the only one to survive, literally, the fallout and shakedown of the academy in the late 1990s. He mastered the transition from centralized authority to distributed power of authorship and pedagogy, as is evident in the many practices and academic voices to which he has given birth. And it's important to cite not only the intellectual success of this group, but also their commercial success, and these two have shifted places in many cases over the last decade with the economic rise and then the fall. More than any singular design, Koolhaas's focus on rhetoric, communication, and the ability to speak to current and developing culture must be underlined as a strategic contribution to a discourse in flux. With his prescient engagement with emerging markets, he staked out new territory, finding relevance, creating academic, financial, and technical spaces within which to operate. Koolhaas's innovation, arguably, in this regard, extend beyond his own practice. What he created was a precondition that permits others to innovate in new modes and fields. Now, I'm not one to bring Rem up to on a podium, but I think the model is an important one that we have to contend with, whether we like it or not. For hundreds of years, there have been adjustments, variations, tweaks to style and building culture. Few totally radical moments of change and disorientation. The moment of modernism, with the conspiring technical advances of steel, concrete, and glass construction, as well as mass production, affected such a rupture, a unique turning point where modes of operation needed to be relearned and values reinterpreted for a new era. We find ourselves again in such a moment, not only because of the changes to technique described above, but because of the expanded breadth of the discipline has admitted so many more to it with such varying profiles. And I think Mark just outlined a whole range of interpretations of what that could mean. The demographics have shown young practices from all cultural denominations flourishing outside of the loci of power where once were the centers of culture. The various fronts on which the digital era has operated have been well enumerated. The speed of communication, the simultaneity of production by way of BIM platforms, visualization techniques from the real to the pornographic, the versioning potentials of parametrics, optimization and performance modeling, mass customization, and the sheer power that the medium has given single individuals to produce what once took teams to accomplish. But what is most remarkable is the way in which education, knowledge, and information have all become aligned, even flattened, a phenomena that is as liberating as it is problematic. What was once reserved for books, elite colleges, and higher levels of education has now become accessible to anyone with an internet hookup, wherever they may be. The impact this has had on formerly disenfranchised economies cannot be understated. But the knowledge has changed too as a result. The moving target of disciplinary knowledge has never shifted so rapidly as it has now. Some of this data is indeed articles, curricula, and pedagogical models that once required tuition to access, but a vast store of it is contained in the gradient range from erudite critical text all the way down to the smut of daily blogs that critique and editorialize the production of architecture minute by minute. The rigor and methods that characterize traditional historiography, theory, and criticism practice were once lodged in the patience of time and tenure. Verification of data, analysis of findings, and strategic retrieval of archival information were all consolidated in the hyper-educated scholar working at a steady clip. Modes now promote an immediate digestion, a constant churning of opinion, and impatience in waiting for the next journal or upload submission cycle. For this reason, standards are tested constantly, and traditional research methods are pit against the endless stream of information flowing out of the internet. The intellectual culture of the blog offers new ways for scholarship to reach the public, sometimes controversially so, platforms that were once not available outside of the elite presses of the university publications. Practice will not tolerate the slow, because in emerging economies, speed becomes the mediating agency by which success is measured, forcing foundations to be poured prior to the completion of working drawings. What was once a classical and organic work of architecture, with all parts to whole relationships thought through, is now conceived of in a more temporally layered way, with improvisation and the invocation of new rules at every benchmark. Changes in the way we communicate have affected great shifts beyond just the rarefied landscape of the academy. While the failed economies of the advanced world tease out the intellectual implications of the most recent architectural obsessions, it is the remote developing economies that can afford to and do build out of the risk of these speculative experiments, an honor once only bestowed to the few. The translation of ideas from one culture to another, not to mention the practices of building and communicating with fabricators, necessarily brings out reinterpretations of the most productive variety. In the new eyes on old ideas, we see resurgence of disciplinary excitement and invention, a redirection of course. Necessarily, the stakes are higher. The scale at which these experiments are undertaken, whether in the hands of the avant-garde in Beijing or the real estate gamblers in Macau, display a gravity that architecture never could before. With cities' growth visible in real time and the environmental damage of mismanaged expansion breaching regional boundaries, the implications become less abstract than ever before. To be clear, the predicaments of the current condition are not straightforward. The potentials and the dangers tempt each other at every turn. What is critical, maybe, though, is the significance of this shift in the role of architecture, design, and its relationship to the world. For those who said that architecture was dead, we know it is not only alive and well, but in fact expanding its domain. The discipline keeps redefining its edges. For those who see everything as business as usual, the potential for architecture's status, instruments, agency, and modalities to open up new avenues of practice and research have been wasted. Much remains to be seen on that. How to engage the current predicament is, of course, a challenge that many leaderships have addressed. Our own culture at MIT has encountered a variety of tendencies over the past 2 decades, most of which remain current and hold the same gravity today as they did when they first elaborated. I'm being polite here. Among them, a strong value has been instilled on not just the product of architecture, but its process. Here I'm quoting: the importance of debates revolving around tectonic expression, the elaboration of light and inhabitation, the process of building community, the identification of cultural differences, the place of architecture in the city and its urbanistic implications, the role of the landscape with urban discourses, the imperatives of sustainability and the emergence of the virtual environment as the basis of speculation, all have formed a complex web of discussions over the years. I'm not mocking them, but the danger of attempting to satisfy any punch list is already readily evident in its insufficiency. We should imagine, much like in the medical field, that as architects we would have a Hippocratic oath to a range of issues and requirements, knowing fully well that by fulfilling them, we have still not addressed the surplus that architecture requires. For instance, sustainability in architecture may need to be an ethic the same way that zoning and other code requirements have come to serve as measures for health and safety, but never a headline or a single directive of any consequence. Architecture instead needs to be defined as a process of building knowledge, of inventing ways in which the discipline is transformed and will be transformed by challenging its very values. Returning back to the question of authority, it is unique and of this time that the power to transform culture is located with students. It's a dispersed power. Students reign over technology, over information, access to knowledge, and the mastery of different media within an interdisciplinary context that makes them able to take on projects that exceed the theoretical in ways that we never had. They do involve theoretical challenges, but are also weighted by mandates of the delivery and implementation that cannot be addressed by those with ancient overheads. All of this does not lessen the authority of the REMs and the so-called star architects, of which I am not one, but the newly distributed power of a generation of emerging voices, some of which have hardly broken 30, is having an astounding effect on the ways we practice, learn, teach, and collaborate, as witnessed even in our own young faculty. At MIT, most importantly, we do not produce the classic architect. I come from that pedagogy, but I'm unable to oversee that kind of pedagogy where I am, if there is such a thing today. We harbor intensification, specification, and the many microscopic views that form the leading edges of the discipline. The many extremities of views as focused through the department's discipline groups allow intensive research on the one hand, but permit a higher level of collaboration and intersection with others similarly inclined towards rigor on the other. It is important to note that at MIT, design is only one of the 5 discipline groups with art, culture, technology, building technologies, computation, history, theory, and criticism, not to mention the media lab and urbanism, having a very strong anchor, and each of them their own directors, over which I am, let's say, a larger coordinator as the head. The notion of a critical type of specification, then, is not one that limits interest. It instead calls for an awareness of how they are strategically deployed and interconnected. A huge task for me, and something I wouldn't say I have succeeded in, but it remains a constant hurdle. To conclude, practice as we know it is on the verge of obsolescence, rightly so, and it is futile to prepare students for it. Instead, the student of architecture should be challenged to rethink what it means to practice. The conceptual ground on which the profession is based need not be hallowed. The what is not always interesting, even if necessary, but the how and the why are what is most critical in our pedagogy, especially at a time when what can come about with such ease and so few critical obstacles. To this end, there is an inevitable link between technique and ideas. Both are important, both change over time. To fortify those new to the discipline with the critical judgment requiring to strategically operate on a shifting field is the task. Softwares change, formal obsessions wax and wane, but a conceptually rich understanding of the project and processes of architectural intent serves well through all weathers. The only way to know if we've done it right is if we go too far, if we test to failure and have to come back again. Thank you.
Now, I hope I didn't ruin something with the projector. Maybe it will. Thanks, Patricia. Our next speaker will be Donna Robertson, and I'm going to try to pull up her PowerPoint. Is it MIBD?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's not good.
No. Click repair.
What does that mean? Is that a bad thing? Okay. It removed something that it says, but maybe it.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right. Hopefully I'll know what they removed. And you won't care. Okay, I will try to keep this brief. I am telling you about a new degree program we started a few years ago, but the intent is not to go in depth into what a new degree program of this sort might be, because I don't think that it's so new anymore. I'm sure that there are a lot of other schools that are pursuing this kind of thing as a post-professional degree. But what Judith has asked me to talk about is how this information or this attitude might trickle into normative professional education. And since at IIT we have both a Bachelor of Architecture and a Master of Architecture degree, that is the next step that we are thinking about with this new degree that we have, which is I have a different image on my screen than what I see up there, so I'm going to have to keep ascertaining what you're looking at. We started back in 2008 to collaborate on this new degree program that was meant to be a combination of the new BIM technologies, at that time quite new in the field, and the rise of interest in design, build, develop in the profession at large, and particularly at our school. And so we started with a Master of Integrated Project Delivery, but the Department of Civil and Architectural Engineers said that your architects, why don't you keep it to buildings? So we actually would prefer it to be a CIPD, but we're constrained. And in hopes of getting the degree through the review process, we acquiesced. So that's what we started with, is a Master of Science in Integrated Building Delivery that turned into an MIBD, because at IIT, if you're a Master of Science, you have to do a thesis. And we wanted to avoid that added level of stricture. So this was intended to be a post-professional degree program for those with a professional degree in architecture. One of the things that we ran into immediately was the fact that there were people from other disciplines who were interested in it. And since we had predicated it on the assumption that you already knew how to design, that provided our first challenge, which we're still working on. But if you read the text here, you'll see that it is meant to instill the abilities and leadership skills to empower the profession towards a position of competency and responsibility in the broader and complex processes of design and construction. We formulated the degree through a one-day charrette that was hosted by IIT's Institute of Design, and we collaborated amongst a number of participants, both faculty, students, current students, overseers from our Board of Overseers, and invited developers, along with David Pistrui, who was very central to this happening because at that time the university had him being the one to promote entrepreneurship across the curriculum. And so we collaborated with IIT's Stewart School of Business in order to conceive the degree. As well, there were 2 members from IIT's Institute of Design, and if you know anything about that program, it is one of the most innovative and well-known design programs in the country, going well beyond the classic definition of design education. You can't read this, but the columns are about format, target student, partnerships, courses, programs, career paths, faculty, and focus. And what we were looking for were affiliations, for instance, partnerships with both, say, the RISE group, which is a major project management group in the world that is housed in Chicago, or the Chicago-Kent Law School at IIT. And we were looking at career paths. Those were real estate or corporate, teaching, banking and finance, facilities, consulting, legal, construction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we were using this as a means to empower one with an architecture degree to go further into these elaborated kinds of careers that have been talked about earlier. So we began with this, this challenge to produce empowered professionals adept in the expanded services mode of practice, managing business strategies and able to anticipate client needs and speak their language, if not be the client. Remember, it's design, build, development. And this is the curriculum that we ended up with. I'll just let you read it yourself and tell you that we have devised the curriculum out of both this emphasis on entrepreneurship and the kinds of business practices that one would need if you were to become not only the designer but the builder or the developer of your project. The goals of the Mib D program are to work more closely with all of the team members in project execution, to develop entrepreneurial initiative in the architect, create a receptiveness to innovation, and a means of apprising and managing innovation in the field. We wanted to embrace and advance the evolving state of the industry, and we mean this in the broadest sense of the industry of the built environment. Because I guess the culinary arts are part of the built environment. I understand it perfectly. We wanted to expand the roles of and better prepare architects for paths already practiced under this new umbrella definition of architecture that we're all talking about. Increase competency and responsibility in the architect. You know, sometimes we've had a bad reputation for caring more about design than the client's perspective on matters. We wanted to create a balance between caring about design and being able to speak and understand the client's perspective. And we wanted to empower people to compete in a highly dynamic business environment. So the definition has evolved a bit because I have a new director of the program. The book BIM in Academia has a chapter co-written by John Durbrow and myself. I was mostly the editor, and John Durbrow at the time was the director of the program. He has since left IIT to go back into private practice in order to do this kind of work. And so Professor Tom Brock has taken over, and he amended the definition a little bit: a collaboration alliance of people, systems, business structures, and practices into a process that harnesses the talents and insights of all participants to optimize project results, increase value to the owner, reduce waste, and maximize efficiency through all phases of design, fabrication, and construction. Well, that sounds like BIM. And it is BIM. But it is also design, build, develop. And this is an interest that arose because we have a number of alumni who have become very successful at doing just this. You see the work here of David Hovey Sr., who practices both in Chicago and Phoenix. This is Phoenix. He also does large-scale condo development in Chicago. This is in a suburb of Chicago. And we have small-scale design, build, develop done by alumni. Thomas Rozak did his own house this way. And then we've also been doing it in our curriculum, as have many of you. In fact, probably most of you by now. This was the team that built, in the center is Professor Frank Fleury and his team of students who built a new artist studio for the Ragdale Foundation, which is based outside of Chicago. It's an artist community foundation. And they were replacing the original artist studio that had been there by the founders of the foundation, and it overlooks the prairie, which has been protected by the Trust for Public Lands. Frank Fleury has also recently completed a field chapel. Maybe some of you noticed it because it actually got an AIA Honor Award. And it's an extremely microstructure, and done in Germany. But it was a wonderful project with the students because they designed it collaboratively, and then they went to Germany one summer and constructed it in collaboration with the 3 villages that were co-distant from this field location where this monocell structure was constructed. And it was a total team effort between those who provided the materials, those who provided and ran the machines, the students, Frank, and those who fed the students all summer. We also do this at the level of the studio, and if you saw the Creative Achievement Awards last night, you saw the work of Catherine Wetzel, Professors Catherine Wetzel, Rick Nelson, and Paul Enders. I think Paul's here. To have students first study existing ambitious structures and then evolve their own that they execute on their own. And so although at a much smaller scale than, say, David Hovey or even an artist studio, this is the beginning of understanding all the components of design, build, and develop. And so let me point out, this is where we're starting to go beyond the post-professional degree program and infuse this curriculum into both our undergraduate and graduate professional degree programs. What I forgot to put in the slideshow is that we reconfigured our master's curriculum, and one of the radical things we've done, and we're 3 years away from an accreditation review that will tell us whether this will fly, is that we've allowed our pro-practice requirement to be satisfied with any of these, of any of 4 of the courses that are in the post-professional degree program, courses such as planning, law, and development, rather than the standard pro-practice, how to run a small office, right? And what the AIA contract is. Hopefully some of that will come into it anyway. Tom Brock has given me a number of slides, a few of which I show you just to show you the attitude towards IPD and BIM that we are using, and I doubt that it's very different from the ones that you understand as well. This is the typical team structure that you might have seen. And these are the kinds of project delivery methods that we are looking at. There are a number of them: design bid build, design award build, DDB with construction management, or just DB, or design construct, design build, operate, maintain. That's what David Hovey's doing. Build, operate, transfer, and then, of course, the standard integrated project delivery. So he's got a diagram, I'm not sure I even understand, about the various directions in which you can take these kinds of practices. And and there's some text. He says there are two key variables which account for the bulk of the variation between delivery methods. Am I coming to the end of mine? I'm coming to the end of mine. The extent of the integration of the various service providers, the extent to which the owner is directly financing the project, and when the various service providers are segmented, the owner has the most amount of control, but this control is costly. So everybody understands this diagram about the difference between standard project delivery and the kind of delivery that we're looking for. Or another way to understand this, the leaner means of project delivery that integrated project delivery intends to be. And then a diagram that's very difficult to unpack in the time I have remaining about, again, the difference between standard project delivery and the kinds that we're looking at. But this one's a little easier to understand in terms of the essentials of the kinds of consultants and people and expertise that need to be involved in the shared project model, and this is the one that I like the best. A little diagram that shows you how many different ways you'll be able to use this, everything from demolition to restoration, aside from standard new construction. And another one that shows the various kinds of softwares that are going to be involved in this. And we're still in the very nascent stages of working out all the coordinations and how different team members are going to get on the same page software-wise. And this is the last slide. It's the fundamentals of IPD for us. While collaboration strategies may vary with each project and participant, some or all of these common ideas appear in an integrated project delivery agreement. A legal relationship, a management committee, an incentive pool, a no-blame working environment, design assistance, collaboration software, lean construction, and integrated leadership. So the last thing I want to say about this is I already talked about how it's working at the graduate level in terms of options for pro-practice requirements and the undertaking of design-build projects at very early stages in the education. That is the first semester work of students. In the undergraduate curriculum, we're still working on how to integrate this into the curriculum beyond the design-build studio. We are rethinking our pro-practice requirement as I speak. And the other challenge for us right now is to think about how to make this available to non-architects and whether there's a zone of post-professional education that adds the design component into this as a means for, say, an engineer to come into this realm of activity. Lastly, I know many of you have read the book by Isaacson on Steve Jobs, and if you have, you know that the meta theme is the combination of design, innovation, and best business practices that made Apple be what it is, one of our most shining examples of American enterprise. And I would take that as a model for what we'd like to do with this program. So thank you.
Thank you, Donna, and thank all of our presenters. Now, we don't have a lot of time, but clearly we need to hear from our respondents. I mean, it's interesting. I suppose the central question, I guess I would like to challenge them with, is we've seen a couple of different kinds of models for schools to engage issues that are relevant to the practice of architecture. I suppose for me the fundamental question is, can the schools lead the profession into its future, or in the sense, are the schools following the profession into this sort of uncertain and dynamic environment? Or however else you would like to spin it. Ted first maybe, and then Jim. I don't know if those are on, but I imagine you can make them. They're live.
Okay, so my understanding of what we've been asked to respond to is the fundamental question of whether architecture schools can lead the profession into an uncertain profession. And the questions that were initially posed were whether the schools have the flexibility and will that we need to address the opportunities and demands within our specific institutional settings. And then we're supposed to be here to talk about institutional and professional change. I'll comment less on the individual presentations than on the questions that were originally posed as our mandate. And folks should understand that I do come from a very traditional background. People know me from 15 years at the BAC, which is a non-traditional educational environment, but I was at architecture school with Charlie Moore and Vince Scully, and I did teach at MIT, and so, you know, the way I look at stuff tends to be, I think, fairly straightforward and in many respects quite traditional. I would have to answer the first question as to whether we have the flexibility and will to lead the profession in the negative. The schools have proven themselves to be capable of developing rather distinctive identities as among ourselves. Tulane is not Minnesota. We're not MIT. And each of us has, in one way or another, developed a fairly distinctive identity for ourselves. And we've done that even within the constraints of accreditation standards, which, to be blunt, haven't changed all that radically in the last 20 years. They're pretty much the same as what they've been for quite a while, and we've learned to live with those. And yet within that context, as schools, as institutions, we've been able to take different approaches to turning out different kinds of graduates. And yet, the question of whether we're likely to lead the profession is, for me, one that has to be answered in the negative, not because of institutional constraints, but because of us. I've been speaking to ACSA audiences for at least 15 years, and I look at this audience, and I see essentially the same people I've seen, at least demographically, that I've seen for the past 15 years. We were asked to invite some of our students. 2 of our students came. They're both African American. They changed the number of African Americans in this room by 50% by their just being here. And when I attended the new administrators conference in Hollywood this past fall, I was stunned to see that of the 35 or 40 odd new administrators who were there, despite the fact that half of our students have been women for the last 25 years, only 20% of the new administrators were women. So we are, to a large extent, the same people we were 20 or 25 years ago. And yet the profession around us has changed radically. The people we serve, where we do our work, I mean, where's the work now? It's in Brazil, and it's in China, and it's in India. It's in emerging markets full of people who don't look anything like us, and as much as we may send some of our students or faculty to work in those places, we have yet to develop true collaborative working relationships with them through our schools in a way that would build networks and foundations that would radically change the profession. We're just not there. I have a very short list of things that it would seem to me that we ought to have been discussing for years that we haven't yet discussed as among ourselves, let alone discussing in a way that would influence the profession. This is the first ACSA meeting that I'm aware of. Thank you, Judith, and thanks, Mike. The first one where we've talked about online education. We didn't want to call it online education. We called it digital technologies. But it's about teaching at a distance and using online stuff that in most of the rest of our universities, departments have been using for a decade. We are only starting to have that conversation. Phil Bernstein sat in this very seat in the previous session and pointed out that at our most elite schools, my alma mater, we still don't teach collaboration. We still don't teach management skills. And it's been pointed out in a number of settings that we still don't use research and case studies and a range of other ways of informing our students that have been common in every other profession for at least 15 years, or 50 years. So to suggest, a handful of schools are doing it, but most are not. So to suggest that we're in a position because of the way we teach, that we're going to be changing the profession is laughable. And in fact, I've heard several people say that the profession always leads the schools. I don't happen to believe that, but I've heard that stated by a number of people who are here. And it does raise in a very fundamental way what it is we need to do as among ourselves to prepare ourselves for change within our own programs that can then influence the change that has to take place within our institutions. And to that extent, I would say that for starters, we need to think very differently about the way we not only teach, but utilize collaborative leadership skills as among ourselves. It has struck me that if you ask anyone outside of our profession what the most innovative design schools are at this moment, by and large, they will say the D School at Stanford or the Olin School down at Babson. Olin is an engineering school that's in an entrepreneurial setting, and the D School doesn't even grant degrees, and neither of them provide accredited architecture programs. That raises some fundamental issues, and both of them can be characterized by the way they teach entrepreneurship, globalization, and collaborative leadership. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, do we in fact practice the stuff we allege to be teaching? The second thing we need to do is address fundamentally this issue of diversity. I mean, I hate to be the one who always brings this up, but Brian Kelly, who ran a diversity session at this particular conference, pointed out that he only got 2 papers for that session. 2 papers. Obviously, we fixed it. Because there's no longer an intellectual interest in that subject. We need to fix that. The third thing we need to do, and I picked this up from one of Jim's conferences a couple of months ago out in La Jolla. I observed what people who are involved with social networking do during lectures. And they all had their iPads out, and I used to think that they were doing their email. I used to think that they were kind of putting themselves in another place. But what I suddenly came to an epiphany around was the fact that they were elaborating on what was being said in the lecture by exploring and authenticating what it was the lecturer was presenting. They were, in fact, bringing a broader range of learning into that setting because of what the lecturer was saying. By and large, we haven't yet learned to use the tools of social networking to our advantage in a way that enriches and enhances the learning environments that we're trying to set up. And then finally, it's obvious that we need to think of ourselves very differently in a global context. We don't require language skills. We don't require certain types of cultural skills. They're tiny pieces within the standards that NAB imposes on folks. But the reality is, our students need to stop being voyeurs or colonialists in the settings they visit and learn to interact as peers with the people we need to learn from who will be our clients of the future. And by and large, we haven't done that yet. So my reaction to, not these speakers, I mean, there's great stuff going on in all of our schools. That's not the issue. The issue is us. And whether we as a group are in fact prepared to do transformative work on behalf not just of our schools, but on behalf of the profession and how the profession serves the world. And I have seen negligible evidence, with some exceptions, in most of our schools. Jim?
Well, thanks for setting that up for me, Dad. A few things about this. The question, can architecture schools lead the profession into an uncertain future? And I think what each of the speakers said, maybe, and no. And so what I'd like to do is challenge that, because I think that each one of us, inside of us, should be able to have a direct positive response to the question. Can the schools lead the profession into the future? Each of us would say yes, and for the following reasons. And then if we can't make that happen, then I think we need to ask a different question. But a whole profession that is currently billing out $30 billion of fees a year in professional fees, and is billing out $1.8 billion a year in exported fees. A whole profession in the United States that this changing planet relies on actually is completely dependent on accredited professional schools as the pipeline to prepare the future of this profession. So it's a huge economic issue, and it's a huge social issue, and it's also the survival of the profession itself. Now, Mark had some, when he would nibbled around the edges in some ways that I hoped he was going to go a little further on. First of all, public-private partnerships and real estate development. Second, the relevancy of design. Third, the counter-intuition in the profession about thinking about the shrinking cities, not just the growing cities. Third, the massive changes in store for students. Nader brought up also 5 that I thought were pretty compelling. First of all, he talked about the population explosion and the need for architects. Second, he talked about the paranoia that we have that could actually become a constructive paranoia. Third, he talked about the demographic challenges that play right into the future of this profession. Then he talked about the new rules at every benchmark, and I loved that, and I want to talk with him about that. And then he talked about the excitement and reinvention potential. Donna then came up with several of her own that began to discuss it but didn't go over the top, and I was wishing she had taken a couple of these things further. First one, the curriculum changes that she feels are compelling, entrepreneurship, which she feels is lacking, the competency and responsibility levels that can go much higher than they have been, and then the need that we all have for design excellence and inspiration. And so the question that I would have really then for the speakers today and for Ted is that why is it that we can't give a more response from our heart and from our head that says, yes, we can do things, and for the following reasons. That has some confidence in it, so that if we've got, if we're parents with children headed into these programs, we know we're going to be delivering overt value that the planet needs.
Well, that was a pretty powerful set of observations, and I'm not sure how it's all gluing together, but I'd like to give the presenters a chance to say something before I ask the audience if they would like to respond.
I'll say something. No, I'd have to take a moderate stance on the question of whether the schools can lead the profession. I think that in some ways we don't. If you ask Phil Bernstein, he'll tell us we're way behind where the firms have gone with BIM. But on the other hand, I can, if I were given more time, I could think of a number of ways in which the schools have led the profession and have developed both design ideas and approaches, research techniques, the whole current practice of research generating design, or to take another mundane example, the development of animation techniques and how the firms want that so badly, and the firms do it better. I mean, the schools do it better than the firms do. And then in a more generalized way, I would say that because the schools house the young people who are the future of our profession and our built environment, they possess a very, very different way of thinking and designing than do the people who lead the firms and find the clients. And I think they're going to want this kind of thinking more and more. I think that young people, because of the way that they have been raised with media, just have a different space-time attitude than I do, I know. And I think it's going to change the way that work is executed in firms in really, really interesting ways. And so that is one of the challenges to us as schools, is how we capitalize, understand that, and then capitalize on this new sensibility that our youngsters have. Those are a few thoughts.
Well, in some ways, we're kind of essential. So whether or not we're leaders or followers, we're going to be there, and we're kind of necessary for the profession as it continues to do what it does. We're not the same thing, and maybe it's simplistic to think about who leads and who follows. I think there's a kind of incomplete mapping between the two, and there's often a reciprocity. So it's a little bit kind of utopian to frame it in one way or the other. I'd like to think that what we do is it's parallel, but it's actually very different from what the profession does. We have the luxury of doing all sorts of things. And, I appreciate the fact that I think that knowing the market is important for architects, but I'm not really necessarily trying to make business people. I just want people who are kind of sensitized to the way that the world works so that they're better at doing what they do as architects. I remember a series of ads that Target ran maybe 15 years ago. And Target was one of the first kind of mass marketers, unlike Walmart or Kmart, to both show blacks and Latinos as consumers, and it also showed gay couples as consumers. And I thought, man, it's not that the marketplace is any nicer or more ethical. They just realized that's a market to be tapped. So in some way, the market leads because it's to their best interest to lead and to be more egalitarian or to seem more egalitarian. And so I can understand and empathize with the frustration at the kind of glacial speed with which we move as a culture to diversify. And I've also had the same sense that, gender is a waning discourse, and I guess everything is kind of hunky-dory. So I appreciate that there are voices like Ted's at the table that continue to remind us that there are kind of multiple and complex agendas, that we do live in a complex culture. I also, though, want to be careful that, we tend to wear this hair shirt as architects, that we're always sort of not doing something right. And in fact, we do a lot that's exceptional, and we think about space, and we think about cities, and we synthesize information in very speedy and difficult ways that I think has value. And so I'd like, as we begin to think of ourselves progressing, and if leading is the operative word, that we don't actually forget what we do quite well, and that we need to exploit those skills and let more people know that we do those things.
I will simply complete your thought.
Thank you. We should travel together more often.
I think one of the leading questions into my presentation was about medium, and I think we should be here to talk about what is the medium of architecture, and to that extent how it's expanding. I'll be specific. Plans, sections, spatialization, all of those things that are about representation and projection and generative have to do with a power over knowledge we have that nobody else has. And to the extent that we can exploit these as giving access to a larger public imaginary about what the relevance of the environment is, what space is, what identity is the way into a more collective discourse. To be generalized about it, and now I speak to Mr. Landsmark respectfully, I also think he's absolutely right. We are doing abominably badly on the front of collaboration and diversity, but I disagree with the way maybe in which you are voicing it. Collaboration, I would argue, is not a good substitute for a good idea. I would always opt for the better idea over the fact of how it is produced. Not because I would want to disenfranchise one group over the other, but in fact, critique and an understanding of the discursive nature of architecture I will always try to fight for before the way it's done, because things are done in diverse ways. Sometimes there is a genius, unfortunately for us. Other times people collaborate in a civil way. Other times people are in a mosh pit, fighting each other, doing amazing things. Sadly, that's the OMA model that I kept referring to, but it has proven to be an amazing way that some models practice. We can't do it, but he does. Diversity is more tricky. I don't sleep with men, but I'd hate for you to think of me as a straight white male. We need to redefine diversity in the same way that I would not want to look at you as an African American, not because I can't recognize the different colors of skin, but by thinking of you in those terms, I forget diversity in the broader sense of the word. I forget Africa altogether. The way that we are submitted to defining diversity in our searches right now is too reductive. I am faced with this every day at MIT because we seek a diverse faculty as well as a diverse student, but the way in which diversity is defined institutionally is too limited to get what I believe that you really want. So there are, now whether this can be generated from bottom up or top down is another debate. I do think, I mean, this is true at the level of those searches and the way that we define inclusion, but it is also a question about whether practice leads or the academy leads. Obviously, there is a symbiotic relationship between the two, but my argument still goes 360 degrees around the same circle to say that what we believe in as citizens, how we act politically and how we vote is absolutely relevant, but it doesn't define how we act as architects with the specificities of the medium in which we operate. It is over that domain that we need to be specific, and it is in that domain that we need to expand.
Yeah, I guess in hearing these voices, I think we do have time, since there's no other session following us, to get some audience participation involved. I guess I agree with the panelists, certainly Mark, with the notion of reciprocity that is essential between the profession. I certainly think that the schools have a history of challenging the profession, and that maybe lead is the wrong word, but I know that follow is the wrong word. And I think that that's what my fear is, certainly relative to certain practices that are engaging the curriculum. And I suspect Donna feels this way a bit too, looking at some of the curricula involved in teaching about how IPD works in the business world. It does not yet feel satisfying to me in most instances about how that we can bring that content into a curricular model. That feels too much like following to me. But enough about what I think. Can we get some voices from the audience on any of these pretty broad sets of topics?
Since there's a gap in here, I'd just like to say something about leadership and your point, because I think that I think that education must lead, and I don't think you should hesitate to say lead. And there are 16,000 architecture firms in the United States, and they have leaders in them too, and some don't, right? And some are emerging, and some don't. And in schools, I just encourage you to think of yourselves as a part of the leadership of the next generation of this profession, and that so much hinges on what you do. And also I encourage you to sit on the boards or the advisory committees of these firms, and to be a leader at that level as well.
Thank you. Are we all conferenced out? No voices? Oh, good.
One comment here. I think that we perhaps have the ability, or at least the practice at this point, of leading other professions perhaps better than our own. Many of our schools offer courses on creativity, design thinking. In the case of my school, we offer it at core curriculum level for 1,000 seats for non-design majors. So in a way, our form of thinking is guiding other professions. Now, the thought that comes to my mind after this conversation is that maybe, without realizing, we are leading our own professions because we are impacting, affecting the client base. We are educating the clients that in turn will modify the professional practice.
Well, that sounds like an interesting note to end on. Thank you
Well
to the
spoken.
panel, and to our respondents, and to all of you for sharing
Thank you,
in this
Judith.
event and in the broader conference.
Brave souls that they are to stay.